The desert had a sound of its own, a silence so heavy it pressed against the chest like a held breath. The wind drifted low, dragging faint whispers of dust that shimmered like gold beneath the setting sun. Heat still rippled off the sand, though the day was dying, and each grain seemed to hold the memory of fire. There were no birds singing, no rustle of leaves, only the faint groan of the earth cooling after another relentless day. A lone rider moved through that silence. His horse's hooves sank deep into the soft ground, each step a dull thud, swallowed by the endless expanse. The man on its back was lean, shoulders broad, face roughened by years of sun and solitude. His hat cast a shadow that hid his eyes, but the way he scanned the horizon made it clear he wasn't wandering. He was searching. The desert stretched out forever in every direction, a burning sea of gold that faded into violet shadows near the mountains. The rider guided his horse toward that distant ridge, his throat dry and cracked, his canteen nearly empty. He'd been riding since dawn, following tracks that the wind had almost erased. They were faint impressions of boots and smaller footprints, likely a woman and child, maybe settlers who'd lost their way, maybe runaways. He didn't know, but something in his gut told him to keep following. The wind shifted, bringing with it a strange smell, smoke, faint, distant, but unmistakable. His horse's ears twitched. The rider straightened in the saddle, his hand instinctively brushing the butt of the revolver on his hip. He pulled on the reins, slowing the animal to a careful walk. The world around him seemed to tighten, the silence deeper, the air thicker. The sun dipped lower, slicing the horizon into molten orange and blood, red bands. Shadows stretched long, chasing each other across the dunes. In that dimming light, he caught at a scrap of fabric fluttering against a dry bush, the kind of thing a child might wear. He rode closer, eyes narrowing. The fabric was faded, once blue but now sun, bleached and torn. Nearby, the sand showed a disturbance. Someone had fallen here recently. He dismounted, boots crunching softly. The air tasted of dust and ash. He crouched, running his fingers through the sand, feeling the faint impressions, small hands, a heel mark, the drag of a body. The trail was fresh. His pulse quickened. The horse snorted nervously. He turned his gaze west, where the last edge of sunlight caught something glinting faintly in the distance. Metal or glass, it was hard to tell. He mounted again, urging the horse forward at a trot. The world seemed to hold its breath as he rode into the dying light. The closer he got, the stronger the smell of smoke became. Then came another sound, faint, fragile, carried by the wind, a cry, barely audible, but real. He stopped, straining to listen. There it was again, a small voice, breaking, desperate. He spurred the horse forward, the sound of hooves echoing against the silence like thunder in a cathedral. As he crested a low dune, the scene unfolded before him. A figure lay motionless in the sand, a woman, face pale and still, her clothes torn and faded from the sun. Beside her knelt a little girl, maybe 6 or 7, clutching a rag doll tight to her chest. She was crying, voice cracking with each sob, but too weak to rise. The rider froze for a heartbeat, the setting sun behind him casting his long shadow across the two figures. For a moment, the world seemed painted in gold and sorrow. He swung off his horse, landing hard, and rushed forward. The girl looked up at him, eyes wide, hair tangled with sand. "Mama won't wake up," she cried, her voice trembling. The man knelt beside the woman, checking for breath, for pulse, for anything. Her skin was hot, feverish, sunburnt. She wasn't gone yet, but close. The girl clutched his sleeve as if her small hands could anchor him there forever. He reached for his canteen and held it to her lips. "Here," he murmured, his voice low and steady. "Drink slow." The child obeyed, water spilling down her chin as she coughed. The horse stood behind them, tail swishing, dust swirling around its legs. Overhead, vultures circled lazily against the burning sky. The rider looked at the fading light, at the dying woman, at the child who had run out of tears, and he made a silent promise. He would not let the desert claim them, not tonight. The desert night came swiftly, swallowing the last colors of sunset, until only embers of red glowed behind the mountains. The cowboy had gathered what little driftwood and brush he could find, enough to build a small fire that hissed and popped in the cooling air. The child sat close to the flames, her doll clutched tight to her chest, eyes still swollen from crying. Beside her, the woman lay unmoving, wrapped in the rider's worn duster coat. He had checked her pulse again, faint, but steady. Her breathing was shallow, each rise and fall of her chest slow, but alive. The heat of the day had nearly cooked her through. Her lips were cracked, skin flushed from dehydration. She'd need water, shade, and time. Things the desert rarely gave willingly. The cowboy poured a little of his remaining water into a tin cup, dampening a rag and pressing it gently against the woman's lips. A drop rolled down her chin, tracing the dust on her face before falling into the sand. "Easy now," he muttered, more to himself than her. "You hang on." The girl hadn't spoken since the fire was lit. She stared at her mother, motionless except for the way her tiny fingers twisted the hem of her doll's dress. When the cowboy looked her way, her voice came out as a whisper. "Is she gonna die?" He glanced up at the stars before answering. "Not if I can help it." His tone was flat, but his eyes betrayed a weight he'd seen enough death to know when the line was close. He fed another stick into the fire, watching sparks rise and fade. The girl's small form trembled. Her name, he'd learned, was Clara. She had managed to tell him between sobs that their wagon had broken down 2 days ago. Her father had gone to find help and hadn't come back. Her mother had tried to walk them to safety, but collapsed before sundown. Clara had stayed because, as she said through tears, "Mama told me not to move until someone came." Someone had just barely in time. The cowboy studied the horizon, now a sea of black and silver under the moonlight. Every shadow looked like it might move. The desert had a way of playing tricks, whispering in the wind, promising ghosts where there were none. But there was something else, tracks he'd noticed earlier near the broken wagon Clara had pointed out. Fresh ones, boot tracks, more than one pair. He'd seen enough outlaw trails to recognize them. They were being followed or perhaps hunted. He leaned back, glancing at the sleeping girl. She'd finally drifted off, exhaustion conquering fear. The doll was still locked in her arms, its button eyes catching firelight like tiny embers. The cowboy stood, moving to his horse tethered a few feet away. He checked his rifle, loaded 6 rounds, and scanned the ridgeline. Nothing moved, only the low howl of the wind. When he turned back, the woman stirred. Her lips parted slightly, and a raspy breath escaped. Her eyes fluttered open, pale, unfocused. "Clara," she whispered. The cowboy knelt quickly, supporting her head. "She's right here," he said. "She's safe." Her gaze found him weakly, pupils adjusting to the flickering firelight. Who are you?" she murmured, voice barely audible. "Just a man passing through." He replied, "You've been out cold all day. You need rest and water." Her hand searched the sand until it brushed his wrist. "Please, my husband, I'll find him," he said, steady but gentle. "You save your strength." She nodded faintly before her eyes rolled back, slipping once more into shallow sleep. The cowboy exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. He'd seen people survive worse, but not often. The night deepened. Coyotes cried somewhere far away, their calls thin and sharp. The stars burned brighter than lanterns, stretching from horizon to horizon, cold and indifferent. The cowboy sat beside the fire, his hat tipped low, eyes half open but always alert. Every creak, every shift of sand made his hand twitch toward the revolver at his belt. By dawn, the first blush of gold crept across the dunes. The air was cold enough to bite, and the little girl stirred beside the fire. The woman was still breathing weaker, but alive. The cowboy rose, dusted off his coat, and poured the last of his water into a tin cup for the girl. "You drink," he said, handing it to her. "We'll find more soon." She nodded sleepily, clutching the cup with both hands. "Are we going home?" she asked softly. He looked east, toward the rising sun, where the horizon shimmered with heat and promise and danger. "Not yet," he said, "but we'll get you there." Then he turned toward his horse, eyes narrowing at the ridge line. There, faint, almost hidden in the glare of morning light, a puff of dust rose in the distance. Someone was out there, moving fast. The cowboy's jaw tightened. He pulled his hat low, holstered his gun, and whispered under his breath, "Looks like the desert ain't done with us yet." The sun was barely up when the child's cry tore through the still morning air. It wasn't the soft, sleepy sound of waking, it was fear, raw and sudden. The cowboy spun around, his hand already on the revolver. Clara knelt beside her mother, shaking her by the shoulders. "Mama, wake up," she sobbed, her voice cracking under panic. The woman's face was pale, her lips dry and colorless, her chest rising so faintly that for a terrifying moment it seemed she'd stopped breathing altogether. He dropped to his knees beside them. The girl's tears streaked through the dust on her cheeks as she clutched her mother's hand, whispering, "Please don't go, Mama, please." The cowboy pressed his fingers against the woman's throat. There it was, a pulse, weak but still there. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "She's still with us," he said quietly, "but she's fading fast." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small tin, the last of his dried rations. Jerky, a few crumbs of hardtack. He didn't have much, but he tore a piece and soaked it in the little water that remained in his canteen. "Clara," he said softly, "help me lift her head." The girl obeyed, her small hands trembling. He pressed the softened food to the woman's lips, coaxing her to take it. A faint swallow, that was all, but it was something. "She needs shade," he muttered. "We can't stay out here in the open." The horizon shimmered with heat already, the promise of another brutal day. The cowboy scanned the land, nothing but sand, brush, and a few scattered boulders. Then, to the south, he spotted a narrow rise, a dry riverbed cutting through the dunes. It might offer shelter, maybe even a trickle of water. He moved fast, packed the saddlebags, tied his bedroll, then turned to Clara. "Listen to me," he said, kneeling to meet her frightened eyes. "We have to move your mama. I know you're tired, but you've got to be brave a little longer." "I can help," she said quickly, voice shaking but determined. He gave her a small nod. "I know you can." With effort, he lifted the woman into his arms. She was light, far too light, her body limp as a rag doll. He laid her gently across the horse's back, securing her with his rope, then lifted Clara up in front of him. "Hold tight," he said. The horse moved carefully over the uneven sand, its hooves stirring little clouds of dust that caught the morning sun. The cowboy kept one eye on the horizon and another on the woman. Each minute that passed without her stirring felt heavier. The girl spoke softly against his chest. "Mama said Daddy was coming back. She said he never breaks a promise." The cowboy swallowed, eyes narrowing at the endless horizon. "Then maybe he's still out there," he said, "and maybe he's looking for you right now." She turned slightly, her small voice breaking. "Do you think he'll find us?" He paused before answering. "If he's got any sense, he'll follow the same tracks I did." They reached the dry riverbed by noon. The land dipped into a shallow gully lined with cracked mud and thin, brittle shrubs. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. He slid off the horse, lowering the woman to the shaded side of a rock. The air there was cooler, just enough to matter. He poured the last drops of water onto his bandana and wiped her forehead. "You're gonna make it," he said quietly, almost like a prayer. "You hear me? You've come too far to quit now." Clara knelt beside her, holding her doll tightly. "Mama, please wake up," she whispered. The words were barely audible, carried away by the wind. Then, for a moment, there was movement. The woman's hand twitched, slow, weak, but alive. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then slowly locking onto the girl's tear-streaked face. "Clara," she murmured. The child let out a cry, half joy, half heartbreak, and threw herself into her mother's arms. The cowboy turned away, letting them have the moment, though his eyes glistened faintly in the harsh light. He moved to the horse, untied his rifle, and scanned the desert once more. The horizon was blinding, waves of heat bending the air, but in the distance, a faint line of dust moved slowly, steadily, too straight to be natural. "Riders," he tightened his jaw. The mother had survived the night, but the real danger was still coming. He turned back toward the pair, the fire of the sun catching his face. "You hold on to her," he told the girl. "No matter what happens, you don't let go." The child nodded through her tears, clutching her mother tighter. As the cowboy walked toward the ridge, rifle in hand, the desert wind rose again, whispering across the sand like a warning. Somewhere beyond that heat and haze, men were coming, and not the kind who came to help. The desert had given them a fragile morning of hope. Now it was about to test how much that hope could endure.